Welcome to Dear Fans. The glow of studio lights illuminated the glossy set of the late-night spotlight where Molly reigned supreme, known for her sharp wit and unapologetic progressive stance. Molly had built a reputation as a fearless voice in sports and media, unafraid to challenge cultural figures, athletes, and celebrities. With biting commentary, her audience adored her, tuning in nightly to watch her skillfully dismantle her guests with quick quips and pointed sarcasm. During a routine production meeting, one of her producers floated in unexpected idea inviting Caitlin Clark to the show. The room buzzed with excitement and skepticism. Caitlin, a basketball icon with an unmistakable presence, had been both admired and criticized throughout her career. Her record-breaking performances and fiery competitiveness had made her a fan favorite, yet her confidence and assertiveness had also drawn controversy. Molly's eyes lit up at the suggestion. This wasn't just an opportunity for a ratings boost, it was a chance to put Caitlin on the spot, to challenge what Molly saw as outdated narratives of heroism and leadership in women's sports. "Let's do it," Molly said, leaning back in her chair with a smirk. "This is going to be fun." Never one to approach and interview unprepared, Molly dove into her research. Clips of Caitlin's games and press conferences played on her laptop. As she scribbled notes in the margins of her outline, she couldn't help but chuckle at the thought of contrasting her polished, savvy persona with Caitlin's unfiltered, non-nonsense attitude. To her, this wasn't just an interview, it was a showdown. Meanwhile, across the country, Caitlin Clark was at home in Iowa when she received the invitation. She sat at her kitchen table, the email open on her phone, a cup of coffee cooling beside her. Her longtime friend and assistant Jenna Friend leaned over her shoulder reading the email with a skeptical expression. "You sure about this?" Jenna asked, raising an eyebrow. Molly's not exactly friendly territory. She's known for going after people who don't fit her narrative. Caitlin shrugged, a small smile playing at her lips. "So, what a conversation is a conversation. People can say what they want. It doesn't change what I've done on the court." Jenna wasn't convinced. She had seen enough of Molly's interviews to know how relentless she could be. "She going to come after you, Kate," she warned. "She'll bring up the critics, the controversies, maybe even question how you carry yourself in the spotlight. Let her," Caitlin said, simply setting her phone down. "It's not about winning or losing, it about showing up." The days leading up to the interview were a whirlwind. Molly's team meticulously crafted her questions, and during every point was loaded with enough irony and humor to elicit laughs from the live audience. Caitlin, on the other hand, carried on with her routine as if nothing unusual was on the horizon. She refused to rehearse, choosing instead to trust her instincts. When the day of the show arrived, the studio was electric with energy. The live audience filed in, a mix of Molly's regular fans and curious onlookers eager to see how the night would unfold. Backstage, Molly rehearsed her open lines, her confidence unwavering. "This is going to be legendary," she said to her producer Veronica, who nodded enthusiastically. "Ratings gold." Veronica agreed. "Just remember, keep control of the conversation. Don't let her dictate the pace." Molly smirked as she adjusted her microphone. "Please, she's great at basketball, but this is my court." Meanwhile, Caitlin arrived at the studio with little fanfare. Dressed in a SLE but simple outfit, she moved with quiet confidence, greeting crew members with polite nods. Jenna trailed behind her, still aware of what was to come. "Last chance to back out," Jenna murmured as they walked toward the green room. Caitlin chuckled. "You worry too much." In the green room, she settled into a chair watching the monitor. As the show's opening sequence played, the audience erupted in cheers as Molly's name was announced, the sound echoing through the building. Jenna, shifting uncomfortably, muttered under her breath, "They love her. They're already on her side." Caitlin glanced at the monitor, watching as Molly stepped onto the stage with her signature confidence. "That's her job," she said, simply leaning back in her chair. "Mine is to tell the truth. Let's see what happens on stage." Molly launched into her monologue, her delivery polished and brimming with energy. She opened with a few lighthearted jokes before pivoting to her guest of the night. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a sports legend in the house tonight." She began, her tone carrying just a hint of sarcasm. "A record breaker, a headline maker, and someone who's been called everything from a generational talent to, well, let's just say, controversial." The audience chuckled, some clapping as Molly grinned. "Yes, folks, Caitlin Clark is here tonight, the queen of the three-point shot, the face of modern women's basketball, and someone who's been making as many headlines off the court as she has on it." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Backstage, Jenna crossed her arms. "She's laying it on thick already," she muttered. Caitlin nodded slightly. "She's doing her job. Let her have her fun." Molly continued, taking a few playful shots at Caitlin's competitive nature, her fiery interactions with referees, And the sum. Time's polarizing reactions she evoked then finally with a wide smile. She turned to the audience. Please welcome to the stage Caitlin Clark. The applause was loud, but not entirely unchallenged. Some cheers mingled with murmur as if the audience wasn't sure whether to celebrate or scrutinize her. Caitlin walked onto the stage with the same composure she carried onto the basketball court. She shook Molly's hand firmly, then took her seat. Molly leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. Welcome to the show, Kate. She said, her voice smooth but edged with curiosity. Are you ready? Caitlin smiled, faintly matching Molly's gaze. Always the tension in the room was almost tangible. The curtain had risen on their verbal duel. Molly was ready to challenge, to provoke, to steer the conversation where she wanted, but Caitlin, she was ready too, and neither of them knew just how much this night would change them both. As the audience settled, Molly Qerim leaned forward slightly, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. Her reputation as a skilled interviewer, quick-witted and unrelenting, was well earned. She wasn't here to make Caitlin Clark comfortable. She was here to challenge her, to expose what she saw as contradictions in Caitlin's meteoric rise. So Caitlin, Molly began, her tone light, but laced with a subtle edge. You've had a pretty wild, record-breaking performances, media frenzy, endorsement deals, people calling you the future of women's basketball. That's a lot for one person to carry. Do you ever think maybe it's time to let the spotlight move on to others? The audience chuckled. Molly had framed it as a casual question, but the implication was clear. Isn't your time up? Caitlin didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly, considering her words. Basketball's not about who gets the spotlight, she said smoothly. It's about competing at the highest level, putting in the work, and earning your place. If people are still talking about me, it's because I'm doing my job. A few claps rippled through the audience, though some stayed quiet, waiting for Molly's next move. Molly smiled, unfazed. Fair enough, but times change. The game is evolving. There are new stars, fresh faces. Some might say that the attention you're getting takes away from the next generation of players coming up. That maybe the conversation should shift to making room for others instead of focusing so much on one person. Caitlin's jaw tightened just a fraction, but her expression remained composed. The great thing about basketball, she replied, is that the court decides who gets the attention, not the media, not the critics. If someone else comes along and plays at a higher level, they'll get the spotlight. And I'll be the first to congratulate them, the audience murmured, and even Molly hesitated for half a second. She had expected Caitlin to bristle, to get defensive. Instead, she had delivered an answer with quiet confidence, as if the idea of competition fueling greatness was the most obvious thing in the world. Molly, quick to, had just leaned forward. Okay, but let's talk about competition. You're known for your fire, your intensity. Some love it, others say it crosses the line. You've had moments staring down opponents, pushing back against referees, getting into heated exchanges. Some would call that passion, others might call it entitlement. Do you think you get away with things that other players wouldn't? A tension in the room thickened. A few audience members nodded, anticipating how Caitlin would react. Caitlin's lips twitched, but she remained composed. I play to win, she said simply. I give everything I have on the court. If that bothers people, that's on them. I hold myself to the same standard I expect from my teammates, and I don't ask for anything I haven't. Molly raised an eyebrow. So you don't think the criticism is fair? Caitlin let without a short laugh, shaking her head. Criticism is part of the game. I've never expected everyone to like me, but if we're going to have that conversation, let's be real. People don't criticize all competitors the same way. Some players get praised for being intense or fiery, others get labeled arrogant or difficult to question. Isn't whether I can handle criticism I can. The real question is why certain players are expected to apologize for their confidence. A hush fell over the crowd. Molly tapped her fingers against the desk, caught slightly off guard. She had come prepared to put Caitlin on the defensive, to frame her as a controversial figure, but Caitlin had flipped the script. She wasn't just defending herself, she was challenging the very nature of the conversation. Molly recovered quickly. So you think there's a double standard? Caitlin shrugged. I think the facts speak for themselves, but at the end of the day, I'm not here to control what people say about me. I'm here to play basketball. A few more audience members clapped louder this time. Molly, still smiling, adjusted her approach. All right, she said, shifting gears, let's talk about legacy. You've broken records, changed the way people look at women's basketball, but do you ever worry about how history will remember you, whether you'll be seen as an inspiration or as someone who is too polarizing for her own good? Caitlin leaned back slightly, exhaling. You don't get to choose how people remember you, she said. You only get to choose how you show up every day. The work speaks for itself, whether people love me or hate me, that's not up to me. I just play the game. The simplicity of her answer carried a weight that settled over the room. Molly had expected pushback, maybe even defensiveness. Instead, Caitlyn's responses carried a quiet certainty and unwillingness to be pulled into the narrative being spun around her. Molly tilted her head. That's a pretty grounded perspective. Caitlyn smiled faintly. You have to be when you've been under a microscope for this long. The audience was shifting now. They had come expecting a verbal duel, a takedown of an athlete often seen as divisive. Instead, what they were witnessing was something entirely different. A woman who refused to be rattled, who met every pointed question with unshakable conviction. Molly leaned back in her chair, studying Caitlyn for a beat before speaking again. You know, she said, I think a lot of people expected this interview to go a different way. Caitlyn chuckled. I'm sure they did. Molly nodded, acknowledging the moment. But I'll admit you've given me something to think about. Caitlyn smiled. And for the first time, the energy between them shifted. It wasn't about competition anymore, it was about respect. As the show moved toward its final segment, the audience sat in thoughtful silence. Whatever they had expected coming in, this wasn't it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most powerful part of the conversation. As the applause from the last exchange faded, Qerim tapped her pen against the desk, her sharp gaze fixed on Caitlyn Clark. This was supposed to be an easy narrative to control, a conversation about arrogance, about whether Caitlyn's presence in the sport was more controversial than inspiring. But Caitlyn had refused to play into the script. She hadn't been defensive, nor had she crumbled under pressure. Instead, she had met every question with a quiet, unwavering confidence. Molly was a done, yet all right, she said, crossing her arms as she leaned back in her chair. Let's pivot to something a little different. You've been called a trailblazer, once in a generation player, but with that comes responsibility. Do you ever think about what kind of role model you are, about the impact your actions have on young athletes watching you? Caitlyn nodded. Of course, I think about it every day. Molly raised an eyebrow. And do you think you're setting the right example? The crowd stirred slightly. This was the moment they had been waiting for, where Caitlyn would either defend herself passionately or slip up under the pressure. Caitlyn didn't flinch. I think being a role model doesn't mean being perfect, she said simply. It means showing up, working hard, and holding yourself accountable. I play with passion, I compete, I push myself, and I don't back down just because someone thinks I should be quieter or less confident. If that's a problem, it's not my problem. A few claps echoed through the audience, but Molly wasn't satisfied. But don't you think there's a line, she pressed? Some would say there's a difference between confidence and cockiness, between being competitive and being disrespectful. Do you ever worry you cross that line? Caitlyn exhaled, folding her hands together. Do I think it's interesting how often that question gets asked? Who gets labeled competitive and who gets labeled cocky? Who's praised for showing emotion and who's told to tone it down? I play the game the same way I always have. I don't apologize for that. Molly's lips pursed slightly. So you don't think you've ever taken things too far? Caitlyn gave a small smile. I've had moments where I let my emotions get the best of me. I think every athlete has, but that's part of growing. You learn, you adjust, and you move forward. What I do is change who I am to fit someone else's expectations. The murmurs in the audience grew louder. Caitlyn wasn't dodging, she was standing firm, not giving an inch. Molly recognized that shift happening in the room. Some people had come expecting Caitlyn to be exposed, to crack under scrutiny. Instead, they were seeing someone who wasn't afraid of the moment. Molly tapped her pen again, contemplating her next move. Okay, she said, let's talk about something else that's been debated, your influence on the game. There's no denying you've brought more attention to women's basketball than ever before, but some say the focus on you overshadows the rest of the league, that it's not just about talent, it's about marketability, and that other players deserve the same spotlight. What do you say to that? Caitlyn nodded as if she had been expecting this. I say that growing the game is the goal, she said. If people are paying attention, that's a win. And I'm not the only reason women's basketball is thriving. There are incredible players across the league, all making an impact, but you don't grow a sport by trying to control who gets the most attention. You grow it by keeping people watching, and if I'm part of that, I'm proud of it. Molly's smirk faltered for just a moment. She had spent years leading conversations about the unfair realities of sports media, about how narratives were shaped, yet Caitlyn wasn't feeding into any resentment. She wasn't playing the victim. She was simply stating facts. You don't think it's unfair? Molly pushed that some players don't get the same recognition. Caitlyn shook her head. Life isn't fair. Sports aren't fair. You don't get handed respect You earn at the game decides, and the best thing I can do for the players coming up is to help make sure more people are watching, because the more they watch, the more they'll see how much talent is out there, the audience murmured again. Molly knew she was losing control of the narrative. She had framed the question to create tension, to push Caitlyn into an uncomfortable corner. Instead, Caitlyn had turned it into something unshakable, a statement of purpose. Molly exhaled, sitting back. She could feel the shift in the air. The audience wasn't waiting for Caitlyn to slip up anymore. They were listening. All right, Molly said after a pause. I have to admit, I expected you to be more defensive. Caitlyn smiled, unbothered. I get that a lot. Molly studied her, tapping her nails against the desk. So, what drives you? What keeps you going even when the criticism is loud? Caitlyn leaned forward slightly. I love the game, she said. It's that simple. It's given me everything, and I know I only get so much time to play at this level, so I'm going to make the most of it. Molly nodded slowly, and for the first time the energy between them shifted. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It wasn't about catching Caitlyn off guard. It was about understanding her. You know, Molly said finally, I think a lot of people expected this conversation to go differently. Caitlyn smirked. I'm sure they did. Molly hesitated, then nodded, acknowledging the moment. But I'll admit you've given something to think about. Caitlyn leaned back, crossing her arms. That's what good conversations are. For the audience who had started the show eager to laugh at Caitlyn's expense now, in quiet respect that they had expected a spectacle. Instead, they had witnessed something rare, authenticity standing its ground. Molly exhaled, looking toward the cameras. While Caitlyn, this has been enlightening. Caitlyn grinned, glad to hear it. Molly turned to the audience. Give it up for Caitlyn Clark, everyone. The applause was different this time. It wasn't polite or hesitant. Wasser earned as the show wrapped and the cameras cut to commercial. Molly sat back in her chair, watching Caitlyn shake hands with a few audience members before heading backstage. She had started this interview believing she could challenge Caitlyn, expose her as arrogant or out of touch. Instead, she had walked away feeling something else entirely: respect. And maybe, just maybe, that was the biggest revelation of the night. As the applause faded and the cameras cut to commercial, Molly leaned back in her chair, exhaling quietly. The interview hadn't gone how she expected. She had walked in confident, ready to challenge Caitlyn Clark, to frame the conversation around controversy, entitlement, and overexposure. But Caitlyn had refused to play along. Instead of getting defensive, she had remained calm. Instead of seeking validation, she had doubled down on what she believed. Instead of allowing herself to be framed as a villain, she had shifted the conversation to something bigger than herself: the growth of the game, the importance of competition, and the value of staying true to who you are. Molly sat at the desk, tapping her pen against the tabletop, watching as Caitlyn made her way off stage. She wasn't rushing. She stopped to shake hands with a few audience members, even exchanging words with a couple of young girls who had been sitting in the front row. Their eyes were wide with admiration. Molly wasn't used to this feeling. Usually she was the one controlling the narrative, deciding which way a conversation would go, but tonight, she had been the one who had been moved. Her producer, Veronica, approached her from behind. Well, she said, arms crossed. That was something. Molly let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Yeah, not what I was expecting. Veronica smirked. You wanted to take down, you got a lesson instead. Molly nodded slowly. Yeah, and I think I needed it. Backstage, Caitlyn grabbed a bottle of water from the refreshment table when her assistant Jenna walked up. You know, Jenna said, shaking her head. I thought she was going to come at you harder. Caitlyn smirked as she twisted the cap off the bottle. She tried. Jenna exhaled, glancing back toward the stage. You really got to her. Caitlyn took a sip of water. I wasn't trying to, I was just being honest. Jenna folded her arms. Yeah, but you made her think. That's rare. Caitlyn shrugged. Good conversation should do that. As they headed toward the exit, a few crew members stopped Caitlyn to shake her hand. Some thanked her for the interview. Others admitted they had been surprised by her presence, her composure. Caitlyn took it all and stayed polite but unfazed. She had been under the spotlight long enough to know that people would always have their opinions, but she had also learned that the best way to silence doubt wasn't with words, it was with actions. The next morning, social media was ablaze with clips from the interview. A few headlines read, Caitlyn Clark handles toughest interview yet and wins without trying. Molly Qerim presses Caitlyn Clark, but ends up gaining respect. Caitlyn Clark just showed why she's more than a basketball star. The responses were overwhelmingly positive. Some praised Caitlyn for standing her ground, for refusing to be rattled. Others noted how the conversation had shifted from confrontation to understanding. Even some of Molly's most dedicated viewers admitted they had come expecting one thing and left with a completely different perspective. One tweet went viral. Molly Qerim tried to put Caitlin Clark on trial. Caitlin didn't argue. She just told the truth. And somehow that was way more powerful. Molly sat at her office scrolling through the reactions. She had been in this business long enough to know that people love drama. They had expected her to corner Caitlin to make her squirm, but that's not what happened. Instead, Caitlin had met every challenge with quiet certainty, and by the end, Molly had been the one left reflecting. She sighed, setting her phone down. After a long pause, she opened her laptop and began typing. Last night's conversation with Caitlin Clark reminded me of something important: the power of standing firm and who you are. Whether you love her or question her, there's no denying that she owns every moment. And in a world where so many people play it safe, that's something to respect. She stared at the words for a moment before hitting post. Almost immediately, responses flooded, and some agreed with her, others pushed back. But Molly didn't care. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't worried about controlling the narrative. She had learned something, and maybe, just maybe, that was the whole point. For Caitlin, life moved on. She returned to the court, the noise of the outside world fading as soon as she stepped onto the hardwood. The interview, it was just another moment, another conversation. People would interpret it however they wanted. But that wasn't her concern. Was basketball was getting better. Her concern was proving every single day why she belonged. And in the end, that was the only thing that ever really mattered. Like this video and subscribe this channel. Thank you.